Good morning. It's actually nice to be back here. I was going to say I missed it when I was away in British Columbia. It was a great trip, but it's always enjoyable to be back here with my brothers and sisters. One of the things that came across my mind this week, I've actually been focusing quite a bit on what's happening in the world, because I think we're entering a phase that is different from what we've seen in the past. One of the things it reminded me of is one of my trips that I took a while back. Lynn and I went over and visited a Nazi prison camp called Terezin over in the Czech Republic. And one of the things I will never forget in that prison camp is walking through it, and you've got, believe it or not, this is one of the better prison camps, not as bad as the others, where they didn't murder as many people. It was a prison camp as opposed to a death camp. But the one thing I will never forget is that they had wooden crosses on the ground. And the wooden crosses were for the Nazi soldiers to lay on the ground with their rifles, and it faced a brick wall. And the brick wall was just torn apart completely because of all the bullets that had hit the wall for the executions they had. And just off to the side from that, there was a gallows where they had, the board coming up to hang people with. And again, this is one of the better camps, but they just executed massive number of people there for no reason at all. And the thing I will never forget is the horrifying atmosphere, but then to walk through an opening in the brick wall, and on the other side of the brick wall was an in-ground swimming pool and a movie theater. And the swimming pool and the movie theater were designed so that the prison camp inmates had to build them for the use of the guards and their families. So they could have a nice family time by coming over, and while on the other side of the wall they're murdering people, on the other side, on the different side of the wall, instead of murdering people, they're swimming and having parties and going to movie theaters. The contrast and the sheer evil was beyond imagination, and I can't explain to you what it felt like unless you've been there. Linda burst into tears several times as she was going through this camp. And it was one of those things that it was the reality of the evil in the world and how terrible things can be. Now, usually, if you've listened to me preach before, you know that usually I don't speak topically. I tend to preach exegetically, which means we grab a book, we go through it. But for this week, I felt the need to do one sermon that's a topical sermon. And what we're going to address is not just, and evil is what brought it to my mind, but what we're actually going to address is God fair? And is God evil by what he's done? Now again, when I look around me this week, again, what's bringing it to my mind is not just looking back at Terezin, but also, we've had in the last 3 months or so in this country and the world, evil sprouting up like I haven't seen it in many, many years. We're having police officers executed. We're having idiots go into churches and gun down people in churches in Charleston. We've got literally, people bartering for how much they're going to be able to get for babies they've killed. It's all around us. And when we look overseas, we see groups like ISIS who are murdering people one after. People are being executed simply because they're Christians or because they won't convert to Islam. And again, the reason this evil comes up is I have to say to myself, wait a second. Many atheists have asked one question, and that question is, don't you worship a God that's actually a genocidal maniac? Didn't God say, go murder the people, take Israel and go murder this nation and that nation? How can you possibly worship a God who's a murderer? Now, the interesting thing is, many times as a Christian, our first response is just go, they're just making things up. But you know something? It's a fair question to ask. We have to ask, is God fair? Is God just? Is God holy? And is God a murderer or not? And we can't be afraid of looking at questions like that because there is an answer. But we have to be able to be willing to go back to the Bible and see what that answer is. So instead of being angry and upset when people ask those questions, let's dig into the Word of God and find out what the Word of God actually says. Now, the one thing that happens frequently over the last several weeks and even over the last several months, I've actually been asking Christians that I run into, what about in the Old Testament where God said, go kill the other nations? What do you think about that? What's the answer to that? One of the answers that I get frequently is, well, God really didn't say that. He really didn't say to kill them. Well, let's look at Deuteronomy 7, 1 and 2. When the Lord your God shall bring you into the land where you're entering to possess it, and shall clear away many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God shall deliver them before you, and you shall defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, and shall show no favor to them. So you have to utterly destroy them. Sounds like God was telling them to kill the people. And if that's not enough, we've also got Deuteronomy 20, 16 through 18, which says, only in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them. Well, it sounds like we can't very well say God didn't say to do it, because God said kill them. Kill everything that breathes. That's pretty explicit. So it looks like God really did tell them to kill them. Well, the second thing we hear sometimes, again, when I've asked people why did this, what's the truth about this, I've had people tell me that, well, God said to kill them, but Israel really took it too far. Well, again, look at what he says about utterly destroying anything that breathes. And also, if we read Exodus 23, 32 to 33, it says, you shall make no covenant with them or their gods. They shall not live in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will certainly be a snare to you. Saying you cannot make peace treaties with these people. You need to drive them away. And again, from Deuteronomy 20, you need to kill them. Anything that breathes, kill them. So it doesn't sound like the Israelites took it too far. It sounds like they were doing exactly what God said to do. Go kill these people. Now, the other thing that I've heard, and I've had people tell me, is it was okay because the Israelites and us have the one true God. And if you're worshiping the one true God, it's okay to do what he says because God said to do it. Israel had the one true God, and therefore it was okay for them to kill the other nations. The problem with that is God still has to be holy no matter what. And the problem with that is other groups will use the exact same phraseology. A group like ISIS is going to say, we're worshiping the one true God. We're murdering the Christians. We're burning them alive. We're chopping their heads off. We're taking little kids and having them chop their heads off. We're throwing people off buildings and then beating them to death. The point is that any group can use that logic. Frankly, also, when I hear about Islam, we talk about ISIS as the extreme. People don't realize with Islam is frequently called a religion of peace. The people who call it that are either ignorant or they're deceivers. Because if you understand it, now that doesn't mean that every Muslim is an evil person. I don't mean that. But if you understand what Islam is, Islam literally as a word means submit. And they're claiming again the one true God. And what they mean by submit is you have 3 choices. You convert to Islam, you pay an exorbitant tax for being a non-Islam person and still submit to their rules, or you are killed. No other choices. If you read what it actually says in the Islamic holy books, those are the choices. So the idea is, as Christians, we can say, yes, we can coexist with another religion because we're not going to force them to become Christians. On the other hand, with Islam, that's not an option. And not only that, worse yet, if you understand what Islam is, it's actually encouraged for Muslims to lie in order to come in and deceive people and take over a country. So again, they can use the same phrase, well, we've got the one true God, we're going to follow God and do this as well. You got the same thing with cults. Take a look at something like Jonestown. I'm sure Jim Jones believed he was the one true God. Every cult in history just about has said we have the one true God and therefore we can do what we want. So I don't think that's a good answer to why Israel, I mean, it's true. I do believe that God is God and that he's the God of Israel, but I don't think that's the answer we can tell other people when they say, why isn't your God a homicidal maniac? And again, it's a fair question to ask. But we're going to get to the answers in a minute, because God is still just, and God is still holy, and God is still true. Now, one of the problems we've got is we're not looking at the context. And also, we're not looking at what God really said. First off, did God really say to kill all the nations that Israel comes in contact with? No, he didn't. If we were to look at Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 15, we would find that, number one, Israel was allowed to make peace treaties with non-Canaanite nations. They just weren't allowed to make them with Canaanite nations. Number two, if there was a war and the other country would not have a peace treaty, Israel was to kill all the men, but leave the women and children and cattle alive for the non-Canaanites. So God actually didn't say kill everyone. And one of these you got to realize here too is these other nations which Israel were to drive out, they were immoral, grossly immoral, but they weren't nearly as bad as the Canaanites were. And that's the reason why God allowed these people to be dealt with differently than the Canaanites. The Canaanites, on the other hand, are the group that God said to utterly destroy. And one of the things you got to realize here also is when I talk about the Canaanites, we mentioned the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hematites and the Amalekites. Oh wait, that's geology. Anyway, we mentioned all these different ites here. They're all Canaanites from the same group. Canaanites, they all came from the same person. We're going to get to that in a minute. But all of these groups mentioned in Deuteronomy 7 are the same group of people. They're all Canaanites. They're just different branches of the Canaanites. Now, one of the things that I think are the reason we get into such problems with understanding what happened here, what God said, again, is context. It's not understanding what happened in that culture and at that time and in that history. Okay? One of the things that I've always loved doing is actually watching advertising campaigns. Not the good ones, but the ones that fail. And you've probably heard of some of these, but for example, I loved it many, many years ago when Pepsi decided to market in Japan or China, one of the Oriental countries, and Pepsi's slogan was, "Pepsi gives life," which when translated into that language came out as, "Pepsi will bring your ancestors back from the dead." Totally different meaning. If you understand Spanish, you will understand why Chevrolet had such horrible problems back in the 60s and 70s when they tried to market the Nova. Well, Nova is two Spanish words, which mean no and va, which means no-go. Who wants a car that's a no-go? They changed it to a different name, and suddenly the car was able to sell. These are the failed campaigns. As a matter of fact, not only that, as far as not understanding cultures, I love some of the instructions. As a person who has to deal with computers every day, some of the instructions we get written by people who know other languages but don't understand English are incredible. And one of them that I downloaded the other day that I saw, not computers, but let me read these instructions to you. The first blow-by-blow balloons and other stolen goods on the lens. And then the lens pen brush, the dust, then the lens surface of the small particles. Figure that one out. The problem is you've got a person who understands a language but doesn't understand any of the concepts that are going on. Doesn't understand the cultural and the syntactical issues going on. In addition to that, my favorite of all the ad campaigns, I can't swear this is true, but I've read about it many, many places that's supposedly true. My favorite ad campaign that failed was Gerber baby food. Now, if you know about this one, what happened is that Gerber has been around since, I think, the 1930s or 40s. And Gerber sold well in the U.S., and Gerber sold well in Europe, and then Gerber decided they were going to sell in Africa. Well, they could hardly sell any baby food in Africa. They couldn't figure out why, until they started talking to Africans to find out why. And evidently in Africa, typically, and when an African product, because of low literacy rates, what you do is you put a picture of what you're selling on the item. What was the picture? A cute little baby on the front of the jar. You can see the problems there. Gerber had horrible problems until they changed their jars. Now again, I didn't see that personally, but what you had is a complete lack of understanding of the culture and the history. That's what we're going to see right now with the Canaanites. That's what we're going to see with the commands that God gave. The first thing we need to look at is who were the Canaanites. First off, we look at who were the Canaanites. They were descendants of Canaan. And that's talked about in Genesis 10, 15 through 19. And Canaan was a grandson of Noah. He was the son of Ham. Now, we don't know exactly what Canaan did. There's a lot of debate over that. But Canaan, or possibly Ham, depending on how it's read, but I think Canaan did something which was so awful and so horrible that Noah cursed Canaan. And he said, "You're cursed, your family's going to be cursed." Actually, Genesis 9:25 said, so he said, Noah speaking, so he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, and he shall be to his brothers." So whatever it was, he did something that was awful. And because of that, he was cursed. All of these people we're talking about were direct descendants of Canaan. In addition to that, if you'd like an example of who some of the Canaanites were, you ever hear the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? Sodom and Gomorrah were all Canaanites. And if you look in Genesis 13, you find that they were called exceedingly wicked. In Genesis 19, it talks about street gangs roaming the streets and demanding people be sent out for homosexual relationships. And I know there are some people today trying to rewrite that and try to say that's not really what was going on. Well, if you can read the book of Jude and you read the original account, it's obviously what was going on. But you had street gangs roaming around for that. And not only that, but in Genesis 19:24, Sodom and Gomorrah were so incredibly evil that God decided the only answer was for him to destroy them with fire and brimstone and completely obliterate the cities and kill everyone in it except for Lot and his family. These are examples of some of the Canaanites. If you want to know about a people, one of the things you should look at is the gods they create. People often create their own gods because they don't want to worship the true God. And when they do, they often create the gods in their own image. The primary Canaanite god was a god called El. Now, El is the same word that the Hebrews used for God with, if you hear, for example, the words Elohim, El Adonai, El whatever. El is the Hebrew word for God. And Elohim, for example, would be saying the mighty God. So El was the Hebrew word for God as well as the Canaanite word for God. But the Canaanites had a whole different meaning for it, because in the case of El with the Canaanites, he was a god of uncontrollable lust, he was a god of incest, and he was a god of murder. For example, their god married his 3 sisters, their god murdered his son and decapitated his daughter, and their god was a god of uncontrollable lust. The second god of the Canaanites was a god called Baal. If you've watched Stargate, you've probably heard that name. Well, that's where it comes from, and down it went through Egypt also later on. That's where they got it from. Baal was supposed to be the son of El. And again, it was the Canaanite god of nature and fertility, and Baal again was an awful god, completely immoral. The third one that I want you to pay attention to is the god Moloch. And Moloch was the god of fire. Okay? Moloch demanded child sacrifices, and child sacrifices specifically by burning the children alive. And whenever you read in the Bible, sometimes you'll read about going into the groves or going into the high places. And you go, okay, well, that doesn't sound bad, flowers or mountaintops or whatever. Whenever you hear that in the Bible, what it's really talking about is the groves and the high places are references to the places of human sacrifice and child sacrifice. So if you come across those phrases in the Old Testament, it's not obvious what they are at first. But they're talking specifically about where they slaughtered their own children. Not only that, if we look at archaeology has found mass pits of child bones in the areas where they're described in the Bible. And not only that, to make things even worse, there are references that we have found in archaeology now that show that Moloch was being worshipped and children were being sacrificed at least as far back as the 3rd century BC. 3rd millennium BC. Now the reason that's important is because that's at least 600 years before God commanded that the Canaanites be killed. And start thinking about this. If you had a society which was completely corrupt and completely evil, and for 600 years practicing child sacrifice and burning the children alive, what do you think that society would become like in 600 years? And we see often changes in the United States in 10, 20, 30 years where things become evil. We see abortion, which wouldn't have even been dreamt of 100 years. It may have happened 100 years ago, but it certainly would never have been thought of as legal in this country 100 years ago. Changes like that. Well, think about 600 plus years of child sacrifice and pure evil. People like Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, in addition to that, if we look at their gods, we see that they actually had hundreds of gods, every single one of them grossly immoral and evil. If we look at the Canaanites themselves, what were they like? Well, if we read Leviticus 18, 21 through 27, those are the verses that Robert was reading that were probably turning your stomach as he read them. It's actually hard to even read those verses sometimes. But we have to look at what they said, because this is a description of what the Canaanites were doing. It says, "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Moloch." That literally means you shall not take your children and burn them alive. Okay? Let's not sugarcoat it. "Nor shall you profane the name of your God, I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination." Okay, I can go for that. I agree. It's an abomination. "Also, you shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion." Yeah, I think that's an understatement to call that a perversion. But that's what the Canaanites were doing. "Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for all of these things the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled." They did it. These are the things that those nations were doing. "For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so that the land has spewed out its inhabitants." That word literally means vomited out the people because of what was going on. Now, when we start looking at this, we start to get some idea of what they were doing. But let me ask you a question. I'm not a parent. Never had that privilege. Most of you are. You've talked to children. I've talked to many children because I've taught children, etc. I've said to children, don't lie. Don't steal. Don't do bad things. Don't listen to your parents at school. I've never once said to children, "Oh, and by the way, don't sleep with an animal. Don't have sex with an animal." The reason? It wouldn't even occur to the kid. It wouldn't even occur to me. Yet God had to explicitly say in the Bible, do not have sex with an animal as these other people do. It shows you how far they've gone. It shows you not only that. This wasn't one crazy guy did that somewhere in the woods. No, this was so common, so commonplace that God had to say, don't do that as they have done that. And the sacrifice of children, so common that God had to say, don't do that. We don't have to give kids instructions like that nowadays. I'm thankful for that. But they did back then because of what the Canaanites were. If we look at 2 Kings 3, 26 and 27. 2 Kings 3, 26 and 27, it says, "When the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through to the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his oldest son who was to reign in his place and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall." King of Moab, another Canaanite, what's he do? Battle's not going well, slaughter his son, set him on fire on top of the wall. This is common among the Canaanites. In 2 Kings 23:10, there was a situation where Josiah came in as the king of Israel, and he said, "I'm going to get rid of all these horrible things." And it's talking about what Josiah did to destroy them. And it says, Josiah, he also defiled Topheth, where they had the slaughter, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or daughter pass through the fire for Moloch. So again, talking about passing through the fire to Moloch, specifically human sacrifice of children. Again, very commonplace. What we have to realize is that in that day, see, if you look at the ancient cultures were pretty violent and extremely immoral. But even by the standards of the ancient Near East, the Canaanites were grossly violent and grossly immoral and stood out among all the other nations as, you're not going to believe what these guys are doing. As a matter of fact, in Genesis 18:32, it says, "Then he said," let me set the context here, sorry. I've always loved the story of Sodom and Gomorrah for one reason, because I love Abraham's part in it beforehand. He wants to barter with God. God, are you going to destroy the whole thing if there's even 50 righteous people in that town? How about 20? How about 10? Keep bargaining with God all the way down. Finally, he decides that he's going to bargain with God to the point where, God's going to spare the town. And he says in Genesis 18:32, Abraham said, "Oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I shall speak only this once," where he'd already spoken several times. "Suppose 10 are found there," speaking about righteous people. And talking about God, it says, "And he said, I will not destroy it on account of the 10. 400 years before the Israelites were told to drive out the Canaanites, Sodom and Gomorrah, this happened with Abraham. And you know what it means? Even including Lot and his family, who I guess were righteous, but really not that great. But even including them, God couldn't find 10 righteous people in all of Sodom and Gomorrah. And righteous, we're not talking about going to heaven here. We're talking about people that just aren't grossly immoral. So in all of these two cities, you couldn't find 10 people that you could save the cities for? That's what we're talking about. That's what we're not getting in our American context. We don't see that a lot. We see, for example, the horrors of abortion. There are millions of abortions. There are millions of children being murdered right here in America every year. Okay? Let's face it, it's murder. The point is, though, is that while that's happening, not to excuse it, but there are also millions of people fighting against it. There are millions of people who are abhorred or offended by it and shocked by it. There is still the ability to have some sense of shock, at least. We find out that they're bartering over human bodies this past few weeks. What I'm saying is, in America at least, there are still people who have a sense of righteousness, a sense of what's right and wrong. That was missing completely from the Canaanite society. There was no one left who could even understand right and wrong. They were totally depraved, and there was nothing left to save. Now, even with people like that, in Genesis 15:16, God was talking to Abraham and told Abraham, "You're going to have to wait 400 years to take possession of the land." Why? It says, "Then in the 4th generation they shall return there, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." The Amorites were one of the Canaanite nations. This is at the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, and what God was saying is, as horrible as they are, I'm going to give them 400 more years to get worse. Then you can go in and take the nations. So 400 years after Sodom and Gomorrah, well, actually more than that, sorry. At least 400 years after Sodom and Gomorrah. Things have gotten so much worse, and then God says to the Israelites, now, go kill them. Go drive them out. And not only that, God also said he was going to punish those who allowed the evil. If you look at Leviticus 20, verses 3 through 5, it says, "I will also set my face against that man and cut him off from among his people, because he has given some of his offerings to Moloch, so as to defile my sanctuary and to profane my holy name. If the people of the land, however, should ever disregard that man when he gives any of his offsprings to Moloch, so as to not put him to death, then I myself will set my face against that man and his family. I will cut off from among their people both him and all those who play the harlot after him by playing the harlot after Moloch." So what he's saying here is, look, if you allow somebody in your community, in Israel, to come in here and slaughter their children by fire and kill them and sacrifice them to the false gods, I'm going to hold you responsible for not killing that person. That's what God was saying. So clearly God was saying, I'm going to judge Israel if you don't keep righteousness here. In addition to that, if we look at what Israel actually did, in Joshua 17:12 and 13, it says, "But the sons of Manasseh could not take possession of these cities, because the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. And it came about when the sons of Israel became strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely." They were told specifically, don't allow anything breathing to live. Utterly destroy them. And what'd they do? Well, we could use them as slaves. We could turn a profit here. That's what they did. And let's face it, they looked at it and they said, these would be good workers. These good workers came and stayed around and corrupted their entire society. It's one of the reasons God had to continuously take out his judgment on Israel. If you look at Jeremiah 7:30 and 31, talking about how did Israel become this way, now Israel's talking about Judah. And it says, "For the sons of Judah have done that which is evil in my sight, declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house which is called by my name to defile it, and they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind." So by the time we get to Jeremiah, Jeremiah is saying, it's no longer just the Canaanites, but because you didn't take action, it's the Israelites that are now burning their children in the fire and offering them to Moloch, because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. If we look in 2 Chronicles 33, 1 through 6, talking about Manasseh, a very evil king in Israel. It said, "Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel." So, did the same things the people that got thrown out did. "For he rebuilt the high places, which Hezekiah his father had broken down. He also erected altars for the Baals and made Asherim, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord has said, my name shall be in Jerusalem forever. For he built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord." Then it goes on. "He made his sons pass through the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and he practiced witchcraft, used divination, practiced sorcery, and dealt with mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger." So by this point in time, we've got an Israelite king who's slaughtering his own children, who's using witchcraft, who's communicating with demons, who's doing everything that they weren't supposed to be doing. Why? Because Israel didn't do what God told them to do. In addition to that, in 2 Chronicles 28, 2 through 4, it talks about Ahaz, who was another very evil king. It said, "But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He also made molten images for the Baals. Moreover, he burned incense in the valley of Ben Hinnom and burned his sons in fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel. He sacrificed and burned incense on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree." So again, we have kings of Israel slaughtering their own children by burning them to death in fire. All because Israel would not do what they should have done. The repeated judgments kept coming on Israel because they didn't kill the Canaanites. The fact is, the Canaanites, the reason God said to kill them is because they were so evil and there was nothing left to be saved in the Canaanites, that they had to be killed for the sake of the world. Just like a cancer that needed to be removed. That's the reason God did this. Was God a genocidal maniac? No. God knew that at a certain point in time, judgment had to come. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, he did it himself. In the case of the other Canaanites, he said, Israel will carry out my plan. Now, we've looked at what the actual Bible passages say, but the question is, what does that mean to us? Number one, does that mean we should pick up a sword and head out the door? No. Not encouraging anyone to do that, and would actually actively discourage anyone from doing that in this church, or any other church for that matter. One of the questions that comes up is, should Christians kill? Number one, the church does not have the right to declare a holy war and decide to go kill another nation. The reason Israel was able to do that was because Israel was not just religious. Israel was actually a theocracy, meaning that Israel was actually the government as well as the religious structure. As a government, God gave Israel the right to carry out war in order to do things on his behalf. As an individual, the people did not have that right. We don't have that right. We don't have the right as the church to decide, we're not the government here. We don't have the right to decide, well, these people are evil, therefore we should wipe them out. It's the same reason why, for example, I have never supported anyone who, for example, would blow up an abortion clinic. Abortion is murder, but I don't believe we have the right to carry out acts of violence against them either. By the same token, we certainly have the right to protest it. But Israel was a theocracy. The other question when it comes to the fact of can Christians kill or should Christians kill is, what does this mean about a Christian who joins the military or becomes a police officer who may need to kill at some point in time. No problem with that whatsoever. The Bible never condemns that, and as a matter of fact, the Bible explicitly gives the ability of justice to be carried out by nations, and if you serve that nation and serve them faithfully, there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, that's a very honorable thing, and you may be forced to kill if you join the military or if you're a police officer. But if you do, again, that's something that's honorable. But it doesn't mean that as individuals or as the church we can decide to go march against some foe. The second thing it means is that nations have the authority to do this. If you look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 and 14, it says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right." The purpose of government on the earth is to punish evildoers and praise right. It doesn't always happen with the governments on the earth, but that's what's supposed to be happening. One of the things we have to look at when we look at punishing the evildoers is the nation actually doing that? I believe God will judge nations when they don't do that. One of the things you can look at in World War II, if you look at World War II, Hitler was a monster. Hitler's plans were monstrous. Many of the Germans were complicit in that as well. What's often left out of that discussion is the fact that Hitler would not have been able to accomplish most of what he did had it not been for a man named Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England before Winston Churchill was. Not only did Neville Chamberlain do everything he could to not honor treaties to protect other countries, but Neville Chamberlain, evidence has come out now that it's almost certain that he actually gave intelligence information to Adolf Hitler to aid Hitler in what he was doing. He was a traitor, yet he was the Prime Minister of England at the time. The fact is, that was a time when people did not stand up for what was right until it was too late. And by waiting till it was too late, horrifying things happened in the world. Had someone stood up and done what was right beforehand, as a nation is allowed to, it would have changed things. Frankly, I look at our world today and I'm horrified by what's happening in the Middle East. We have people being slaughtered right and left by ISIS. And the fact is, it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. Because we're not standing up against them and taking the position we should be taking. I hate to ever advocate war or killing. But there are times when a culture has gone to the point where it is so grotesquely violent that it's necessary to take military action. I personally believe this is one of those times. And the fact is, if you think about ISIS for a minute, think about where Islam wants to go, and then give it 600 years to get worse. If you had 600 years of rule by ISIS, what do you think would be left after that period of time? All of a sudden, maybe you get a picture of why God said wipe the Canaanites out. Because the fact is, you wouldn't have anything left. And God would spare those who are righteous. But the fact is, give them 600 years of control. What's even worse, frankly, and horrifying to me is, we have one of the mega churches locally that in the next 2 months is going to have a joint conference with imams and pastors to come together to fight bigotry and to proclaim peace and have joint services and somehow going to worship God together. Christianity can stand next to Islam because Christianity is voluntary to follow Christ. You're still going to go to hell if you follow Islam, okay? But we're not going to go to war against them. Islam cannot coexist with any other religion. It's different from Buddhism, it's different from Hinduism, it's different from every other religion you can think of. Islam, by its very theology, cannot coexist with other religions. When you see what's happening with ISIS, what you're seeing is, maybe it's a more extreme view of it, but the fact is, when I look at a church in our area cooperating with Islam, I got real problems with it. And it's not just, I have no problem, for example, if someone goes down and tours the mosque down the street. I know Pastor Paul did that before he left here to see what was down there. That's very different than holding a joint service with them. But that's what's happening right in our own area. Don't say we got to go to a war with them, but at least don't hold a joint service with them to promote them. But the fact is, back with the nations right now are not doing what they have to do to protect to protect the world against people like this. On an individual level, what's it mean? What about capital punishment? Frankly, there are some people that I believe deserve to die for their actions. It's extreme cases. I don't believe you deserve to die for jaywalking, even for stealing from a house or anything else, okay? But when I look at a guy like the Charleston shooter, had he not killed himself, I would say, yeah, I got no problem with putting him to death. When I look at the Boston bomber, I got no problem with putting him to death. When I look at John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy or guys like that in the past, no problem with that. That may offend some people, and you may say to yourself, how can you be a Christian and yet say it's okay to kill someone? Number one, I'm not killing them. It's the government with the government's authority killing them. That's an important distinction. I was never given the right to carry out capital punishment on my own. Neither were you. But another important distinction comes up where I actually years ago was on a national radio show, on a talk show. And I was asked the question, a couple of us were on it, we were asked the question, how in the world can you have capital punishment and people fighting for whales and all these other things, but then abortion goes on too? How comes Christians can be for capital punishment and against abortion? Pretty simple. I've never yet met an unborn baby that committed murder. I've never yet met an unborn baby that committed an act of terrorism. I've never yet met an unborn baby that flew an airplane into a building to kill people. The fact is, when you look at the two things, abortion is the murder of the innocent. Capital punishment is the killing of a person who justly deserves. Now let me say this. Yeah, there are probably mistakes in capital punishment. So the implementation of it we can argue about. But the fact of, does the government have the right to do it or not? No, I think they do. Certainly in cases where there is absolutely clear what's happened and where it's a terrorist attack or something of that nature. But to compare that to abortion is an absolutely horrendously false argument, because the fact is, abortion is the murder of the innocent. We're not talking about innocent people, we're talking about capital punishment. It's two totally different things. So I have no problem saying capital punishment is okay, abortion is wrong. And again, when we talk about capital punishment, I will admit, there are some times when it is unjust, there are different ways. We can debate over how to carry it out and who gets it and who doesn't get it. But the fact is, to compare that to abortion is absurd. Yet we hear that all the time. Now, in addition to that, we have to look at the fact of when we're talking about killing today, it has to be extreme circumstances. Again, war should be avoided if at all possible. Capital punishment should be avoided when possible. It's not for trivial things. But there are times when it gets so extreme, things have to be done. In addition to that, it must be sanctioned by the government. You can't have individuals deciding or the church deciding we're going to go kill somebody. It doesn't work that way. The other thing to remember is this: just because a government sanctions capital punishment or war doesn't mean it's right. There are times when Christians have to stand up and say, I'm not going to do that. Don't care if the government said to do it or not. I'm not going to go kill somebody down the street because the government said to do it. So it's not automatically right because the government says. Frankly, I mean, take a look at governments like China over the years, who's killed, tens of millions of Christians. It's not right for anybody to do that no matter what the government says. Take a look at the Islamic countries, many of whom are murdering Christians today. It's not an isolated thing. People don't get that. It's not just occasionally it happens. Many of your Islamic countries, it's standard. If a person converts from Islam to Christianity, it's a death penalty. That's the norm. So it's not automatically right because the government says kill. But on the other hand, if it's not sanctioned by the government, it's not right. We don't have the right to just go take lives on our own or as a church. Now, we've talked about some of the implications on our life and on our country. Let's go back to the original question. What about God? Is God a homicidal maniac? Or is God a God that's a holy God and a just God? When we get asked a question like that, we can't simply blow it off and say, oh, you don't believe in God. It's a fair question. It's a legitimate question, and when we have a hard question, the answer is go back to the Bible, study the history, study the context, find out what's actually talking about. Because there are answers in the Bible if we're willing to take the time and look at them. And this is one of those answers. God did what was necessary and just. As God, he was able to determine it was necessary to wipe out a society that was so unbelievably immoral and evil that there was nothing left to save from that society. God is just and God is holy, and as a holy God, he was able to say, wipe out the Canaanites. Had that happened, frankly, a lot of things we've seen in our world never would have happened as far as the evil things we've seen. A lot of it traces right back to that. But the point is, when we get a tough question, don't assume that God's wrong or God's a homicidal idiot. Instead, get a tough question, get into the Bible. There's answers there. And don't be afraid, don't be intimidated because somebody comes up. I've seen many Christians wilt in the face of somebody saying, what about Israel and the Canaanites? They don't have the answers, they wilt, and suddenly can't tell them about the love of Jesus because they're afraid of what they're saying about the Israelites and the Canaanites. I have no problem whatsoever saying God ordered the Canaanites to be killed by the Israelites killed them in God's name, and Jesus loves you and died for your sins. They're both true and they're both compatible with each other. When we got a problem, go back to the Bible. The answers are there.